Welcome to The Vault. Tune in every week to unlock the marketing secrets of some of the fastest growing businesses. You'll hear practical tips, strategies, and case studies that will help you build incredible marketing campaigns for your business. And now, here's your host, Stacey Kehoe.
Welcome to the show, Johnathan. Happy to have you here today.
Happy to be here, Stace.
I would love to kick things off by telling our audience a little bit about your background and how you got to be a podcast editor.
Well, from the age of 4, I started bashing frying pans in the kitchen and I had an extreme interest in rhythm and music and things like that. Wanted to do music and ended up doing it for a career for about 10 years. Got signed to a little label in Paris. Well, not so little. They had Block Party, Chemical Brothers, these kind of...
Wowza.
Pretty, some high profile stuff.
Yeah.
But it definitely got me into audio. And that's kind of what led me into the podcast space kind of thing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So as you know, we've obviously we work on this podcast together and we're towards the end of season 2 now. And as I've mentioned to you many times, I just get so many business owners saying to me, I'm subscribing to your podcast, I'm listening to it. How did you get started? What are you doing? Who's helping you? There's loads of questions that are coming through. So I'm really excited to have you here and kind of dig into some of those because I know that it's a very hot subject. Lots of people are getting into podcasting or are thinking about getting into podcasting. So I think today is going to be a really cool chat.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with a bit of a beginner's guide. So if you're thinking about starting a podcast, what sort of things should you be thinking about?
I think at the moment, because it has boomed, one of the most important things that you can do is find your niche. And then I think as one of your guests, I can't remember who, said a couple of times, niche down and then niche down again.
Yes.
Because...
I think that was actually our very first episode, Kristen Marquet, who was speaking about PR and about getting PR coverage. And she was talking all about niching.
Extremely good point and something really important to consider because it has boomed and as much as podcasts have been around for about, ever since really Ricky Gervais and, he kicked it off, he became the podfather sort of in the comedy world. But that's going back quite a long time now, probably, over 15 years. Since then, everyone's got onto it. And now sort of every business is realizing that they need to have a podcast because it's just another great way of promoting your wares and giving a lot of free information these days is actually how you generate leads more effectively and sort of trust in your brand and that you're actually going to do a good job for them. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, I used to be one of those business owners that was really nervous about sharing how we do things or what seems like our little secret sauce to making things work really well in the world of marketing. And I spent a good few years actually really protecting and trying to protect our IP or the way that we did things. And I actually realized that it doesn't matter. Like most people who want to learn how, for example, in my industry, how to do digital marketing, you can learn it yourself. Of course, you can study it. You can, there's loads of YouTube videos you can read books. There's so many ways to self-teach yourself how to do that kind of thing. If people are really into it, they will. Most people don't want to learn how to do that. Most people are not interested. They want to do what they're really good at. They want to manage the business, their own businesses, and they want to outsource that talent. And a great way for capturing their attention is by teaching them how to do it, what our processes are, what our approach is, what are our methodologies, really just giving away loads of free information actually gets the attention of our customers because they do trust you more. There's more of a relationship there. They then understanding the how you do something actually gives them that confidence to go forward and actually hire you. So I completely agree. I think it's really, really important to just give the information away. If I could speak to my former self who was nervous about sharing information, I would just say the people that are going to kind of rip off your ideas or try to copy your processes were never going to be your customers in the first place anyway. So it doesn't really matter.
Very good point.
Yeah, and I think all it does is it positions you, by sharing content, it positions you as an expert, as someone who's not nervous about IP and wants to share information. And I think that actually attracts attracts business.
Yeah, and it's much the same with, in the podcasting world. I think it's important just to let people know exactly how to get set up, exactly how, what equipment is best to use, best practices, all these kind of things. At the end of the day, it's going to create a better product. And of course, I could talk all day to you about audio production and all the stuff that I do, editing, but it's not something that you're going to steal or any customer is going to steal from you, because they'd have to sit down for a couple of years if they ever really wanted to master that.
Yeah, you've got to have that talent.
Yeah, so it kind of speaks to what you were saying about, you shouldn't be afraid to give this information away, because it's just going to create a better product. There's going to be a PDF that's available very shortly from podcasteditingservices.com, where it's just going to explain really everything you need to know, all the different options, whether you're on PC or Mac, how to set up for face-to-face interviews, things like that, best microphones, entry-level, mid-level microphones, and sort of the top-end stuff as well. So really, depending on what kind of setup and what kind of approach you want to take from the get-go, it's all going to be explained in there. And also how to monetize your podcast as well, which is another thing to bear in mind. And if you're coming at it from the perspective of monetizing a podcast, and that is kind of the end game, so it's something you want to do and actually try and make financially viable without having to find other sources to fund it, then definitely the sound is actually the most important thing to consider in the first place. We're sat here now with a couple of Rode Procasters on boom stands. Even if we stamp our foot a little bit, it's not going to create something that you can't edit out in post. That's and having a setup like this is extremely useful from the beginning, because it's starting as you mean to go on. Your podcast is going to sound consistent throughout, rather than sort of sounding rubbish in the first episodes and then progressively getting better.
Yeah,
or just
right. When you're trying at the beginning, when you're trying to get the attention of an audience and build on that, you want the sound to be as good a quality as it can be. Yeah.
And of course, people just don't like listening to bad audio, and advertisers aren't going to, whether you're looking at doing sort of live reads on the podcast, which is a really effective way of getting paid. As soon as you have a few subscribers, like over 500 to 1,000, you can definitely start looking into doing this kind of thing, which isn't too hard to achieve if you niche down and if everything's tagged properly. People are going to find you if they're interested in your subject.
Well, I found that really interesting too, actually, looking at our audience and who listens and where they listen from is always really fascinating. I feel like we have a really big audience in Canada. So, hi, Canada.
Hi, Canada.
And I don't know why, because we don't have any business in Canada. Most of our business is in the US, the UK, and across Australia. So interesting that people do find it. It's a really, really, I find it fascinating kind of getting into that. So let's go back a little bit and actually I'd like to ask you a couple of questions around equipment, because that is something that people have asked me lots about. What kind of microphone should they get? How should they be recording? What kind of equipment do you think, if for somebody who's looking to get started with podcasting, what should they begin with?
First, let's tackle the mics. So the lower end price range, you can go for something like a Blue Snowball microphone. Is that actually what you've got?
Do you remember I went through quite a few mics? So when Johnathan and I first started working together, I had already bought some of my own equipment before, trying to be organized before we started working together. And you gave me some advice that the sound quality was pretty rubbish and made some suggestions. So I think I had bought about 3 different microphones, and then you were just like, look, just buy one of these. This is going to be so much better. And the quality is great.
And this is a great little test right now, because I've just realized sitting across from you that I'm much closer to my microphone. And so if you just pull it towards
slightly
you now,
closer.
This is a really good exercise in mic technique.
Okay.
So take it from the cradle just there.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid.
I'm not afraid.
And sort of position it.
I get nervous about this. So for anybody that's listening and trying to understand what we're talking about, we're just moving the mics so that we're equal distance away. I have a tendency to project my voice quite a bit. You seem to be quite a quiet speaker.
Yeah. So what I've done on this H6 Zoom recorder down here is I put my input gain a little higher because I talk more quietly.
Right.
I'm more softly spoken.
And after editing the last 2 seasons of our podcast, you understand that I like to yell.
Right. There's no shame in that. Continue to do
Hey,
what you
I'm
do.
proud of it.
But because I've adjusted the gain a little lower on your side, you can pull this right up to exactly where I have it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to be too loud. So if you do that for me right now,
Okay, we're going to test it
then
out.
we'll have exactly the same. So get it right in there.
Oh my God, how close do we want to put this?
Exactly.
Okay, this is pretty close. This is
good,
about 2 inches from my face.
A microphone like this with a the Rode Procaster is going to have best results at about 2 inches away. And then you just adjust the gain on your mixing desk to suit how close you are.
Yeah.
So if you kind of go a little loud like this, I've got the gain set so it doesn't ever go into the red. And these are really the two main things for you to try and understand.
Think about. Remembering to record is also a good thing. So for anybody, so we're talking about mics here. So the couple of suggestions you said, one was, what was the first one you said? Blue Snow, something or other?
Entry level's Blue Snowball microphone. And there's also something like the Samsung Go mic. Mid-range, Blue Yeti, and also Audio Technica's USB. And also there's a CAD Audio U37 condenser mic.
Most of these we can get on Amazon.
Probably going to find a good price. To the listeners, if you're enjoying the sound of this, then you might consider just spending a little bit more and going for a Rode Procaster or a Rode NT USB. Now the Procaster we got here has got XLR outputs. They go into a digital recorder, but you can get this as the USB version as well.
For me, I'm just like, tell me which microphone to buy so I can plug it into my computer and it will record for me.
For most people who are trying to do it that way, the Rode NT USB is going to be the one you want to start off with, and you probably won't need to buy another mic.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to that into the show notes too. So let's talk about setup, because one of the things that I did not anticipate prior to launching my podcast was just everything that you need to organize. So things like, where to host it. How do you get it out across, into Spotify and Stitcher and iTunes and Apple Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts? I had no idea really. So you worked with me on that. So why don't we talk a little bit about some of the things that you need to think about when you're setting up a podcast?
A lot of people are using SoundCloud. It's free to set up an account with SoundCloud. That does generate you an RSS feed. It's pretty straightforward as well, just uploading your tracks, things like that. You can title your tracks, you can link to Facebook website. And after you've uploaded your track, you can then submit the RSS feed through Podcast Connect using your Apple ID. It'll ask you to validate the information that comes up, which it automatically pulls from the RSS feed. You can see it all there visually. And at the point that you're happy with it, you can submit that.
Perfect.
It's not that obvious when you're starting out, and even what I just described can sort of stump some people. So that is why we do offer that as part of the service.
Yeah. I think that was really helpful for me too, because for one, I just hadn't thought about it prior to launching the podcast, but I think it's great. And obviously part of the service that you have done for us is getting that all set up. The hosting platform, essentially you're submitting, once you've got it all set up with the RSS feed that kind of spits it out. So essentially anybody who doesn't know what an RSS feed is, once you have a piece of content that's on an RSS feed, you can then generate, it automatically spits it out to wherever the RSS feed is hooked into. So for example, for our one, it goes out to Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Apple Podcast. There's, I don't want to say hundreds, but there's quite a few, isn't there, where it kind of gets published.
Well, you can submit the RSS feed to all sorts of more kind of indie level podcast networks as well. But a lot of people just stick to the main ones because they want to drive all the traffic to like iTunes, get all the reviews there, because it allows you to kind of push yourself up the ranks, so to speak, and maybe even get in sort of new and noteworthy at the very beginning if you direct all traffic to one place.
Yeah. Well, what I liked about kind of using, I think it's Buzzsprout that we host on, isn't it? And the one thing that I love about that is that once you do the setup and once you've hooked it into all of these other distribution platforms, you just have to worry about this one platform on Buzzsprout. So submitting the file there, and then it kind of spits it out all over the place.
Exactly.
Which, I was really impressed with, because I don't want to have to be worrying about, I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of business owners that might be thinking about starting a podcast, is you're trying to save time, So you're looking for, how do I do this the quickest, easiest, cheapest, and most professional way possible? So I think that's a really, really good.
Yeah. And once it's set up, just for people that maybe still strict, because when you explain this for the first time, it is a little something for people to get their heads around. Say, for example, using a Buzzsprout account or a Libsyn account. There's alternatives as well, like Blueberry, and even Omni Studio isn't quite a cool platform. Once you've got all your stuff in there, iTunes Spotify, everything pulls from that same RSS feed. So you don't need to submit stuff repeatedly to platforms. Once the setup is complete, anything you upload to a Buzzsprout is going to talk to all the other networks. So therefore, it's very, very straightforward to publish a podcast in a matter of minutes. Yeah.
The other thing that I think is important is, so I know for you, this is post-production, but it's one thing that I think is important to think about early on, which is the cover image. What is your podcast cover image going to look like? So do you have any top tips for what should be included? I mean, do you like to see the podcast host face and an image of them, or do you think it's better to have artwork? Like, what do you think about that?
I personally believe that a lot of people do judge a book by its cover.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get a high-res, professionally shot photograph of yourself and some alternatives and have a cover professionally made, you can do these things fairly inexpensively on platforms like Upwork or Freelancer. But you're going to need a high-res, properly shot photo, something that you do with an iPhone or something like that. As good as their cameras are, you're going to probably struggle to get it looking the way you want.
I advised some of my business network that we were going to be hosting this podcast, and they've thrown a few questions back to us. So I'm going to fire a couple of those at you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So one of the questions that came in was, what are the top 3 mistakes most people make with podcasting?
Not having the microphone or the recording source close enough to them when they're speaking. Also being in an environment which is not good for recording, such as something with a lot of reflective surfaces, like a conference room that's made of glass, something like this. A lot of people are trying to record good audio in environments like this. You just get a lot of slap back. It sounds like you're in some kind of cave.
Like an echo, you mean?
Yeah, it's kind of like an echo. If you click your fingers in a room like that, you'll know what I mean. Whereas this room, because there's quite a lot of stuff in it, is quite deadened.
So for our listeners, we're inside my office here in London Bridge and we have a lot of desks and, bookshelves, and I actually have a lot of stuff in my office, don't I? In a nice way, not in a hoarder way, which probably sounds terrible on this podcast, but in a way where we have a lot of little art pieces and things all over the place. So that's good. So environment is really important.
Environment is super important. Recording in a kitchen where you can hear the fridge freezer sort of turning
Humming.
on. Air conditioning units are really bad news as well. Although it is possible to remove some of this stuff in the production process. But if you can record audio in an environment where there's almost no noise and you have good mic technique, i.e. being a couple of inches from the mic and adjusting the gain accordingly so you're not distorting on your recording device, then you're 90% of the way there towards a good result.
Perfect. Another question that's come in is how to craft effective and interesting questions for guests.
I think this is a research thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would agree with that.
If you're going to interview someone about any particular subject, you kind of need to know their background, how they arrived in the position that they're working in, or what they're working on. And just thinking from the listener's perspective, a lot of what makes a podcast, and this goes back to sort of the mistakes as well that people can make when starting out, is you really need to make it engaging for your audience. You need to understand from the get-go why you're doing the podcast. If you're trying to deliver interesting information, you need to be asking questions that are going to prompt an interesting answer for sure, and not just a yes or no.
Yeah, of course. Open-ended questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Understanding your audience. I mean, that's like any form of content marketing. If you have to understand your audience, if you don't understand what your audience are looking for, then it's going to fall flat and people are just not going to be interested.
Yeah, and another big mistake people make as well, to speak to the question before, is that people talk over each other sometimes too much as well, or they'll cut their guest off, or they'll...
Hint. No, just kidding.
They'll just direct, the conversation in a way where you're sort of cutting off the content flow.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think you probably remember back to an episode earlier in this season where we did one with our team, which was around company culture. So we had, I think there were 5 of us that ended up being on that podcast. And that was, I'm sure, a huge challenge for you with editing, just because
I don't remember it ever being a challenge with you, Stacey.
Really? I don't know. I think that one was, we were just a bit crazy and everyone got a bit carried away and everyone was cutting each other off. And it was like...
You don't hear half the stuff that I get.
Yeah, I'm sure.
to edit.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit? What have you got? You don't have to name names, obviously, but what is the craziest thing that you think you've heard in a recording that's come through to you for editing?
I think just relentless dogs barking, lorries driving by. It's could you have chosen a worse place?
Yeah, sure.
To record your podcast, I don't know. Some people
I suppose that must stick out to you just because in terms of editing, that must be hard work. So that makes sense. I've got another question here for you that's come in from our business network. Podcasts are very popular now. How do you ensure your podcast doesn't go to podcast heaven?
If you're niching down, you're delivering something that hasn't been done before necessarily, or you can interview all the same people as one of your favorite podcasts. If you ask them different questions, you're doing something original. You just need to think, would I want to listen to this?
Yeah.
Or is it actually going to be useful in a practical way?
To your listeners.
To your listeners,
yeah. Right. Yeah. So I guess it does come back to that same earlier, understanding your audience and what your objective is for the podcast, what you're trying to get out of it.
Yeah. Why are you doing it? I mean, some people obviously, they just want to get into it because they'd like to maybe switch from their current job and end up being paid for doing something like this, because it is possible to do that if done right. But I think really it's all about research, from everything from your questions, the equipment you're using, and just making sure that you start off on the right foot, because you have to remember that if your podcast sounds amazing, guests are going to be on your show. If it sounds dreadful and you haven't put enough sort of thought process or working with someone like myself to make sure that I'm not trying to sell myself there, but it really is important. It will fly from the beginning.
Yeah, I think
that
it makes sense, because a lot of the times where I'm getting these questions in from people, just, when I'm casually meeting people at events or it's clients or things that have listened to the podcast, and a lot of people are interested in doing it. They want to do it, but they feel nervous about not delivering value or it not sounding great. And they want to do it. If they're going to do it, they want to do it well. So I think, that all makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I do, because of this particular problem with podcasts, especially in the early stages, I do offer to actually go, even to your office, like I have here, today with you, set up the microphones here to make sure that we get a great sound.
Yeah.
This is something that, I don't see a lot of other people out there doing, but even if you just do it once, it's worth the money just to figure out, okay, this is how it needs to be done.
Yeah, sure.
And, take pictures of your setup,
so you know what you...
Exactly, and then you're good.
You've recorded your podcast, you've got it all ready to go, it's being published. What sort of things can you do to up your listenership?
Number one, tell all your friends and family. I know that sounds like a bit of a not the answer necessarily that people want to hear, but you need to get some hits on your podcast. You need to get some plays so that you can create a snowball effect after that. Social media, obviously, massively important for a new podcast.
Yeah.
Show notes, transcriptions, obviously. These are an amazing way to boost SEO for your podcast. So if people are looking for a certain topic and you're covering it, they're going to find you like that.
Yeah. Great.
You can promote your podcast at conferences, events, meetups, seminars, anything else really that you can.
Do you know, I have a kind of a weird story to share about this, which is I make it my goal in life to get every Uber driver to download my podcast. It wasn't on purpose. It started as a bit of a joke, but basically, when you get in the car, and I like to talk, if you haven't noticed, and I start chatting away to, the drivers, and I probably take a few too many Ubers, to be fair, but get chatting away. And most, as you probably realize, most Uber drivers have more than just one job. So they're either, they've started their own business and they're kind of doing Uber as like a supplementary income, or they have a business already and this is just a little extra thing that they do. So it's been kind of amazing to just get talking to those sorts of people, and they often have marketing challenges, right? So of course our podcast mostly talks about marketing and all that kind of thing. So I just find myself naturally having conversations with them about marketing. And so then now I just make sure I weave into the conversation, oh, actually I have a podcast and we cover all of these tips. So give me your phone. Let's download it.
Yeah.
But I guess that's kind of a silly example. But I understand what you mean in terms of just every person that you're coming into contact with. If it makes sense, then ask them to download, listen, subscribe. Because if the content is great and it's relevant for them, why wouldn't they?
Just like having a book. Like I know you've just brought out a book.
I have, yes.
Yeah, I've got to get my teeth into that. Anyway. Is that available to buy?
Officially launches the 19th of March.
All right.
Yes. So it will be just a little in a week or so's time from when we're publishing this
such
podcast.
a better business card to have a book, obviously, than a business card. And in the same way, a podcast kind of serves the same kind of purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, so I've got another question that's come in from our business network, which is... how does the value of podcasting compare to video production? If I'm thinking about it from a small business perspective, should I invest in podcasting or should I invest in video? Are they comparative? Should you do both?
Whilst you're recording your podcast, also video, you're doing it.
Yeah.
So you can repurpose that for YouTube.
Yeah.
Because some people just love a good visual.
Yeah, sure.
I'm personally the kind of listener that wants to close my eyes, lie back and listen.
Yeah.
And it's usually to do with the fact that we all look at screens too much in our lives, right?
Yeah, sure.
I think this is a huge reason why audio podcasts are so popular. But yeah, I think that to also video yourself is a great idea.
I love to think of myself as the queen of repurposing. And for anybody that's attended any of our content marketing workshops, we always cover our process, which is the content waterfall. So sorry, giving ourselves a little plug here. But, we always talk about having multiple forms of content. So whether that's visual, audio, written, actionable content. And it just, for me, it totally makes sense that you either, if you've got audio, then great, repurpose it for video, have it transcribed, release it as written, helps with your SEO, as you've mentioned. Do it all, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just covering all bases. So if people want to read, listen or watch.
So once you've got a podcast that's sort of up and running and you've got a good listenership, what sort of ways are there to monetize?
Live reads is a really popular one. If you ever listen to, comedy podcasts or such as Bill Burr, his Monday morning podcast, or the Thursday morning, Monday morning podcast, just checking in on you. There's all kinds of companies out there that are looking for popular podcasts of any kind, really. As long as it's sort of in line with their brand, they'll send you copy, you just read it out. And they'll pay you for that. So
if they listen to your podcast, they see that you've got a good listenership, their audience matches your audience, it would just make sense for them to want to advertise on your podcast. So that makes total sense.
Exactly. Merchandising is also another, whether you decide to do things like mugs, T-shirts, beanie hats, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
paper
great.
clips. It's just ways of making someone's into your podcast and they're buying into what you're doing and they want to support you. Having that stuff available and talking about it at the beginning and the end of your podcast is going to allow you to maybe continue without digging into savings or something like that.
Yeah.
Crowdfunding, promoting a Patreon, for example, is good. Sponsorships is really just sort of another
form of advertising.
Another form after live reads. Sponsorships.
So lots of different avenues, I suppose. What do you think in terms of, I guess it's different for every industry and for every sector and probably for every advertiser, but what sort of stage do you think in your podcast journey, do you think you could start looking for advertising? So are they looking at your listenership? They're looking at how engaged your listeners are? Like what kind of things are advertisers looking for?
If you're creating a great product to begin with, you can get advertisers working with you even if you only have, 500 listens a month, something like this.
Yeah.
It's not difficult to get there. So these options are available to new podcasts pretty quickly if you're being consistent. And one of the main things also they look out for is that you are very regular with your output, because obviously they don't want to start advertising with you if you're going to have 2 months off.
Yeah,
so if you're recording something and publishing it every week, you're going to have a lot more, or even more frequently than that. Yeah, advertisers are going to want to work with you straight away because they know you're going to grow.
Do you have any final tips for podcasting? Anything that we haven't touched on that you think would be relevant for somebody who's just starting out with podcasting or thinking about launching pretty soon?
I would say at this point, after everything we've covered, I would just say don't worry about it too much. There's help out there, the kind of help that you need. If you try and tackle all of this stuff on your own, you'll be giving up before you've even bought the microphone.
Yeah.
So I think
you've probably heard a few people say on this podcast already, it's really about being prolific, not perfect. Really just getting stuff out there is a good place to start and not overthinking things too much. And I think really challenging, for a lot of business owners, myself included, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it takes a lot of you really have to just put yourself out there and get it live and then kind of critique and evolve and just progress with it.
Yeah, and have fun. Just have fun with it, because it can be fun. It doesn't have to all be about advertising or sort of the end game.
Yeah, sure.
If you're having fun to begin with, people will listen to you just if you're having a laugh. That's one of the most important things. It doesn't matter how serious the subject matter you're tackling.
Yeah, exactly right. And actually, that's some of the feedback we've got from some of the podcasts too, is they just like listening to the conversation. Yeah. It's almost like you're sneaking in and listening to a private conversation, which is always quite fun, isn't it? That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you sharing your advice on how to get started. And hopefully some of the listeners who have approached us about podcasting and wanting to know how we got started and how we're doing that have learned something today. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Stacey. If anyone wants to reach out to me as well, my email is info@podcasteditingservices.com, and I'll be glad to answer any questions for beginners if they have anything else they want to ask.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
You've just been listening to the Vault podcast with Stacey Kehoe. If you've enjoyed the show, she'd really appreciate you leaving a review on iTunes. And don't forget to head over to www.thevault.global for more free content that will help you build an effective marketing strategy.